my gosh. I was like,
hello, everyone.
I also didn't realize I didn't have the slide deck either.
No problem,
Okay,
girlfriend.
so
I'm on it.
I learned a lot about our attendees. We have people from Wisconsin and California, Los Angeles, Atlanta, all over.
Very cool. I love it.
Yeah.
So I will, in a second, share my screen. I'm just trying to figure out the best place to do it from. Give me 1 second. Okay, okay. Let me close this. So what's the coolest thing you learned while I was away?
Evan's here. No, I'm kidding. That's not cool. I'm sorry. I'm giving Evan a hard time. He works for us. He's the best. If you see Evan in your attendees channel, shoot him a private message. He's one of our sales guys for Workforce, and he is the best, even though I give him a hard time. What else did I learn? I learned we have 4 people from California and 1 person from Malaysia, someone from Maryland. That's about it. Those were the fun facts.
Ah, very good. So can you see my screen now? Are we ready to roll about 7 minutes in?
I can see your screen, and this is so exciting.
All right. Well, thank you. First of all, everybody, before I got cut off, I was so excited, wishing everybody happy International Women's Day. For all of the women out there, for all of the incredible men that support us every day. Thank you for coming. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for your time. It's a crazy year, crazy new year. There's so much going on. And so we're so happy to have you here. I know Crystal introduced herself. I will introduce myself a little bit. Before I disappeared, I heard her say that I live in Buenos Aires, Argentina, which is absolutely true. I've been here for the last 5 years. I'm a bit of a global citizen, originally from Serbia. I lived in the States for a little bit over 20 years, in London a couple of years before my move down to Latin America. I have a PhD in organizational psychology. And my life mission, life goal is to make people happy at work. So imagine, as much as all of your heads have probably been spinning around what's happening in the world today, I've had many sleepless nights trying to figure out, how do we make people happy? You know, how do we make sense out of the crazy world that we live in today? And more importantly, how do we make it a better world than what we left before the pandemic broke out? And that's actually the topic of our conversation today. Is you know, I don't know about your dinner tables, but I actually had a conversation last night with my partner around what the world is going to look like moving ahead and what organizations are going to do. And you know, he travels for work and he works in the oil and gas industry, and so his dynamics are a little bit different than mine. I've worked in technology my entire life, and so even between us, we're constantly negotiating and thinking about, where is our workplace going to be? Will I be working from home? How much is he going to be traveling? And just talking about, in, you know, recruiting and finding the best people and making the right choices for ourselves. What does that look like in the future, and what are companies going to do? So I think that this topic is so incredibly relevant for organizations, but it just touches every aspect of a person's life, no matter what line of business you're in, whether you're in a people or HR team, or you're just working. It just has such an incredible impact around, where are we today? And as organizations, as humans, how do we think about moving forward?
Mm-hmm.
So with that, a lot of course, what we talked about is, you know, what does this hybrid workforce look like? And so there's really this continuum, this spectrum around the traditional ways that most organizations worked, which is on site and being in the same office, to this wild pendulum that we swung over the last year of so many people that could working remotely. And now we look at this continuum and we find ourselves asking, as an organization, as an individual, as an organization, what do I offer to my employees? What's the right thing to do? As an individual, thinking about, what is it that I want? And so here you'll see a few interesting statistics. One is from a PwC study that said 68% of executives believes employees should be in an office at least 3 days a week. On the opposite end, 55% of workers prefer to continue working remotely at least part of the time, at least 3 days a week. So, a big reason why we thought it was so important to have this conversation is how do you have that alignment? How do you have that conversation between some of the executives that are going to be making decisions and view the world in a certain kind of way for how things have been done and how business needs to be done, but also really staying in tune to what it is that employees want and where do they feel like what kind of work arrangement do they need to they really bring their best selves to work every day.
Yeah.
I believe that this conversation is going to be ongoing. Whatever we're seeing today, we're not done. No matter what kind of conversations we've had internally, no matter what kind of ideas we've had, no matter how much data we have, the world is going to continue to evolve. And
Right.
as individuals, we're going to learn about ourselves. And as organizations, we're going to learn more about what it is that people want.
Mhm. What I find interesting about the statistic is it says 68 of executives believe employees should be in the office for company culture, not for
Mhm.
productivity, not for getting their work done, for culture, which to me,
Mhm.
I mean, that's fascinating because you would think that from an executive level it'd be for, well, because we need to keep an eye on them, as people quote unquote have said. But really it's because maybe they feel like culture is something they want to be able to keep a pulse on and be able to see.
Yeah.
I know the farther sometimes you get up, like the less like Slack shenanigans you get up to. I know that there's a lot of like we have some really fun channels, but when you're not
Yeah.
the boss, you get to have maybe more Slack shenanigans than you do if you are the boss. Not every
Yeah.
Slack conversation has to be a urgent one. But that's what I find like interesting about that statistic.
Yeah. Well, and a lot, yeah, and a lot in having conversations with some of my colleagues and friends in the field is what a lot of people have said is that historically for culture, people have invested in a lot of material things,
Mm,
meaning like really cool offices, really cool cafeterias, free lunches, teams. And so one of the first things I remember a lot of my friends who are organizational psychologists when the pandemic started to break out, one of the questions they had is how do we keep a virtual culture? Because so much of what we thought about and how we measured it was actually in physical ways. And
yeah,
now that everybody's dispersed, how do we know that exists? Because for a lot of people, it's also the differentiator, right?
right.
So you have your salary, you have the specific things that you're working on. But especially, I would argue more and more today, the reason people select an organization is for that culture
Mhm.
and how it's set up and what does that mean. And so it's interesting because again now what we're saying is executives maybe in some ways still haven't exactly figured out. They're saying culture is really important. How do I take it virtual, right? And there are some ways, and towards the end of our presentation we'll talk about some specific things to keep in mind. But one thing that's for sure is that to really win the best talent, now you're going to be competing with organizations that are providing the flexibility that
Yep.
is very different than what happened before the pandemic. So to remain competitive, in many ways, you're going to have to be more flexible. It's not even, I mean, it is an option, but based on the data I have, I think organizations that are going in being very rigid in industries where they have the ability to be more flexible will start to think about, well, you know, I would advise to do pulse checks, to do temperature checks before you start to see yourself and you're like, wait a minute, where's everybody going? Why can I not attract the best talent? Because you're going to be digging yourselves out of a hole. You might say, think about what are some of the things that are non-negotiable, but then think about what are some negotiable because again, according to Boston Consulting Group study, 60% of over their 12,000 sample across several countries said they want some kind of flexibility. It wasn't always necessarily only in where they work. There was also some more flexibility in when people work, which I think is an important part of the conversation because again, when we took people physically out of the offices, it was about where. It was about work from home. It wasn't as much about when, but you're finding individuals saying, to really keep the best balance in my life, I need a little bit more flexibility there as well. So, how do we achieve that?
Mhm.
So this, I
Ooh.
know, Crystal, when you and I were preparing, this was actually a slide that you said, we can spend so much time talking about this. And I said,
No.
yes. And it's a good thing that we actually have 6 more slides
Ooh, don't let
based on these
me forget.
topics that come right after this. And so I think one of the things that can be particularly overwhelming to organizations, and this is actually partly why both Crystal and I are here, because with my PhD, I'm, the organization led person. Like, what can companies do? What can you do if you're in a position of leadership and a position in, people team, HR teams? What can you do? But I think that there's one thing we really need to think about is that there's also a whole aspect around flexibility, around culture, around productivity that can be very much person driven. So
Mhm.
it's not just about only about policies, only about what does HR make available, what does IT make available, but one could argue that relationships, inclusion, and well being are also very much impacted by people. And so, what we wanted to talk a little bit more about is also some empowerment. So, the idea around what are some things that organizations can be doing, and then what are also some things that individuals should and can be empowered to do to really help us make this shift into a new world that, again, none of us exactly can define today, but a lot of us are proactively trying to figure out what it looks like. How do we give as many people as possible this active role? Because I do believe we're going to be more successful and more effective. And it'll also be less draining on leadership and HR to be able to do things better.
Mhm.
So this is where Crystal and I really stopped and said, okay,
So many thoughts on this. Like, I mean, I even have thoughts like when we were talking, relationships and well-being and inclusion, also around talk about like to me, well-being not only means asking me, hey, like, do you have like the tools you need to go to the gym or work out, or do you want a credit to a fitness pass? Like, because those are things that I think sometimes we, or no, we, larger organizations always are saying, well, your personal life stays over there and your work life stays over here. And frankly, that's not true, bro. Like, I don't know if anyone's ever traveled for work with your colleagues for like over a month, because I did that one time. Let me tell you, the personal and the professional, when you're like living out of hotels for 2 weeks at a time, they skew. Like, so, or when you're, living at the office for a camp, like a sprint, we were like doing my last company, we did like a developer sprint. And even the marketing team just stayed on site to be supportive. Let me tell you, sleeping on the floor in your office, like, really blurs
Yeah.
the line. And I think that now, as we talk about relationships over digital, like we've never met, and yet we're becoming vast friends. And,
Yes.
but that means that you have to blur that line between
Mm.
professional and personal, because at the end of the day, we're all home. Like, you're gonna hear my wash machine going, or you're gonna like see my mom like doing dishes. Like, I don't live with my mom; she just happens to be here. That got weird. But like those are the things that I think people want to have such like a separation of church and state, and
Yeah.
that's not the world anymore. And frankly, that's not millennials or your Gen Zers. Like, we
Yeah.
grew up online, we live online all the time. We have moderate discretion, I would say, at least I would say I do. But, and I think that that's where you get some of the more old school traditional thinking.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's interesting because I think that you're going to have different kinds of perspectives and
Mhm.
people are going to approach it differently. And so, how do you create a space that if somebody doesn't want to overshare, they don't have to, but if somebody
Right.
wants, like you said, like you and I never saw each other in person, but we know so much about each other's lives through chatting because we both chose to have that kind of relationship and that's what we were comfortable with. And
Yeah.
so when you think about all of these different involvements, it's interesting because now you're going to get more differences inside the workplace and you're going to get more people asking, I want to share this, or you know what, I don't want, like, I don't want to start my one-on-one with my manager talking about like what my kid did over the weekend or the health of anyone. And so um I think that's where this understanding of the different people and creating a space that's even more inclusive is going to be really critical.
which the
And so
organization
in
can do.
yes, yeah, like anything's possible. It's just challenging some of the norms. So when I was creating this presentation, I made the slides a lot more text heavy than I usually do. So for all of you that are on, please don't write all of this down. We will share the presentation, we will share the recording, but I just wanted to make sure that I know one of the things that people have gotten feedback on over time is it's great to think about hypothetically what's going to happen with the world, but can you please bring it down to real life and tell me practically what I can do today? And so that's what we really wanted to do with this presentation. And you'll see that for the two different pillars and the six different items across the two, we share best practices for each one. And then we actually share some survey items that you can take. Why? Because again, that conversation with your people is so incredibly important. And we wanted to make it as easy as possible. And maybe you won't use these items at all. Maybe you won't use them exactly. But if you like some of them, and if you're saying, I feel like that's really interesting, we literally just wanted to make it a copy paste for you. So put your pens down or your iPads or whatever, and we can just have a conversation and we'll absolutely share this. So, one of the things that I saw a lot and read a lot and studied about is communication. And what's interesting is that for many of us who are working remotely now, I was looking at a stat for how much the increase in Zoom use, and I think it grew like 300 fold in the pandemic. Like it was like astronomically high number. And I can't even imagine how many organizations bought Slack, Teams, Workplace. All of a sudden there was this huge need for digital communication. And as we start to evolve the working model, go into the hybrid model, it'll be important. So, for example, if Crystal and I one day are sitting next to each other in an office, but we're working with Evan, for us not to have
No,
not to have
we're bringing you to Buenos Aires, Evan. Don't worry.
yeah, everyone come here. We can split the years and choose wherever it's summer. So to make sure to not exclude someone. So if we have a quick side chat and make a decision, how do we continue to make sure to use those digital channels that we were using much more intuitively, maybe during the pandemic, not to leave some of the team members out? So that will be from an organizational standpoint, really understanding what technology do you still need and not starting to remove some of the things where you're saying, okay, now we're much more in person. So this kind of conversation might not have to happen online as often. So staying very cognizant of that and making sure that those kinds of channels are in place. And then leaders just oversharing information. And when I say oversharing, I mean it. I mean it over any one of these digital channels, over email, in any town halls or meetings. When I think back about all the years that I've worked in employee engagement space, by and far, the item that always got the lowest score pretty much across any organization was communication. Why? Because people always felt like there was information they didn't have access to. Like there was something going on, some kind of conversation, some kind of decision that they weren't a part of. And so now imagine people being in different places. Imagine being at home and wondering, what is my team talking about? Are there decisions being made? There's a lot that's reality because there's going to be an adjustment period, but a lot of it is perception too. So the more organizations can over communicate, the more people are going to have those kinds of self doubts that they don't need to around, am I being left out because I'm not physically in the place where most of our team is? What's interesting too is this was a phenomenon before as well, in the sense that people are in different offices.
Yep.
So you might have your executive leadership in one office, and people who are in a satellite office might think, oh, I'm never part of any decision. So it's actually not a new problem, but a problem that I think is even more important to solve now. So here, just again, a couple of items that you can use to gauge over time how well informed people feel, if they feel like they have good visibility into what's happening in the organization. And then also look at it systematically. Like, is there a difference based on locations? Is there a difference based on generations? Is there a difference based on genders? Like, depending on the size of your organization, I would almost say, no matter how small you are, I would look at the different views, because a lot of times when you ask people and when you look at the data overall, you miss those really critical nuances. So communicate, over communicate. I think that will be just absolutely vital moving forward. Another big item is development. So again, as people are remote, one of the questions that I think organizations are going to have to be very, very particular about is setting goals and measuring their process progress. So when I went through my PhD program, we talked about SMART goals. And I remember when I left and I graduated, so having them be specific and measurable and actionable and all of that, I just thought,
You
well,
have to
there would
get a
never be an
PhD to know this
organization.
stuff. You don't have to get a PhD
Yeah.
to
No,
know
no,
this.
no. Most people know it, but like I remember I went to get my PhD right after undergrad. So like
Yeah.
remember I wasn't in the real world yet.
Ah,
And so that was the caveat is I thought of course everybody had goals. And then I went in the workplace and I was like, wait a minute, where do we record our goals? Like, how do we know? And people are like, nah, you know what you need to do. So it wasn't maybe as prevalent as I, as a young student, expected it to be. And so that I think again will become increasingly relevant because it'll help so much with where work gets done and when it gets done. Because if somebody is really clear on their objective, they will more likely go to their leaders if they say, hey, this is my progress. I'm stuck accomplishing it. How do I do it? It'll matter less. Am I working on it at 8 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock at night? I'm doing it when is most suitable for me because I'm at my best in the morning or I'm at best at night. But if I'm not tracking progress, that's a challenge. Let's proactively address it. And if I am, that earns me the flexibility to say it doesn't matter what time I work. So again, everybody knows about goals. I would say take a step back and think about your teams and how many people actually have them because it is a best practice. It's forever old, but it's kind of one of those things like you should eat healthy, you should get exercise, and I have to admit I don't every day, so I need to remind myself this
but it
is a
also
very
goes back
similar kind of thing.
it goes back to your culture point because frankly, like I work in marketing. You know what I do have? I have other friends who work in marketing at other companies. And I can see, it's not like we all don't talk about our jobs. Hello. Like, and so your company will benefit from your employees talking it up because I know that, XY
Yeah,
company has them on these plans or, I'm on this plan. And we all talk about it. I sit in a ton of like women in marketing, uh, like not Toastmasters because we don't, but, mind
yeah,
Minecraft groups kind of. And that's just something that we discuss is the world is, as you go digital, the world's gotten smaller. We're all connecting, whether it be like they're like hashtag marketing Twitter. It's a whole community of
yeah,
people that share their experiences at specific companies. Nobody's like hiding where they work anymore because frankly, does it matter?
yeah,
And so those reputations around even having like millennials or whatever you want to call us, like we have the wants of great culture and great freedoms, but we also respect institutional structure because we know we can
yeah.
thrive in it. And when you're in a job where you want to be able to see a path, if you don't have that, why would you invest in a company that's not investing in you?
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually brings me also to the next 2 points. It weaves nicely into it as one, when it came to development, a lot of times it's fun to have a training in person and it's fun to get everybody together. It's going to be prohibitive for some time, not forever, but for some time it will be. And so for organizations to really think about, but there's so much growth in digital learning and there's some really, really amazing courses out there and ways to develop skills. So for organizations, they used to really thrive on we're going to have monthly development events and we're going to do it in different offices and to really now that hopefully the chaos hopefully has subsided a little bit to think about what are some of those online things, what are the ways that we can connect people also virtually, how can we develop them that it's less tied to physical presence,
Yeah.
at least before the pandemic. And actually the last bullet was something that came out of one of our QuestionPro surveys that we just did earlier in the year with our employees. So we're at QuestionPro, we've been work from anywhere since the pandemic started, and we're across almost all continents at this point. We're not, um, and I mean, I guess at this point, almost it doesn't even matter if you're all in the same city. You probably rarely see each other, but we're not. And one of the recommendations actually that a few of our employees said is, hey, we need to give promotions more visibility because that way we'll know that it's, it's happening, that our colleagues are moving on up. So it's more of a casual way. And for us, we then actually created, thanks to Evan, you're going to be like the most famous guy ever, but we created a wins channel in Slack. And one of the things that we do celebrate there are promotions, are different movements, because it is something to be celebrated. It's a huge accomplishment always, especially during this period that's really difficult for everybody. And so for the person that got it, how amazing is it for everybody in the organization to take part and enjoy with you? And for the people who are their colleagues, it gives them visibility that there is a path, that even though
Mhm.
the economy globally is really tough, that we still are moving people up, that we still are recognizing the really hard work. And so it's a really a two-in-one kind of success in that sense. And so then again, here are just some items around both skill development, making sure that people feel like they can progress in the organization. And again, I would really recommend checking in on these things on an ongoing basis, because sometimes you might implement something, employees could really celebrate it and it could go really well, but either it's not being implemented consistently or was enough for that one period in time, but the world around us changed. So it's very dynamic, but it encompasses skill development, not necessarily tied to promotion or pay raises, but then also very much the career advancement, because you could have both. You could have an organization really invest a lot in people's skills development, but there's no movement as far as positions going, or even the opposite, where maybe people are advancing, but they're feeling like, okay, there's still a lot of things that I want to learn. So we want to touch on both of them. And then the final one from the organization side is collaboration. So one of the important areas for organizations will be when you have people working together to proactively pick individuals from different groups, right? And so here we say different locations because it could be a physical office, including people remotely, but this in an intentional, maybe also unintentional way, gets at inclusion, gets it in diversity, because we are probably going to see some systematic differences. And I, as a woman, as a mother, can speak based on the numbers that I've seen, in the US, the BLS numbers, all the different research, how many women dropped out of the workforce, how they're going to return. And so it might be very likely that more women are going to be at home. And then we also see all of these incredible statistics around how when you have more women as a part of the team, as part of an executive team, how much better the organization does. So I would say for organizations to people on projects will be really important. And then over time, if you can pull back a little bit, but still measure it, because people can fall into what's comfortable. They can fall into, choosing people around them. So I think that that's really critical.
Mhm.
And another bit that again came out of our survey that I didn't think to ask necessarily proactively, but it was just so incredibly eye opening, is that even though we're not in offices together, people were telling us they want to get together. And so they were saying, we'd love to have more virtual get togethers if we're in the same city in a very safe way. We'd like to get physical get togethers. And so I would think about that. I would think about for the people who are, whether they're commuting distance to the office, but they don't come in regularly, or maybe they're a little farther away that prevents them from coming in all the time. What are some events where you can still get that physical interaction and collaboration for individuals that are not in the same office all the time?
Creating those shared experiences, I think, is that's what, because it's like I don't mind being online, but it's about having shared like experiences with people over time, not work
Mm.
experiences like anything else experiences. And you can do that. There's a Airbnb, it does tons of events now. So does VRBO. You can hire people for all sorts of
Mm.
random stuff. But also, something I think that is a good takeaway for people is don't just
Mm.
think about the people in your necessarily like North America region, but when we think about it, well, who
Mm.
all is online at the same time? Because I know that we have a team in India who's working our hours. So make sure they feel included in the, whatever we might call as North America happy hour. It's like, well, you're going to forget 50 people who are also still on Slack. So make
Yeah.
sure they're included in your team events or your region events even if they're not in your region. And I think that's something that we like, something that I know, is a really good growth opportunity for everyone with such global
Yeah.
teams.
Yeah. And that's again, like, I think I love your point, and that's why I'm such a huge proponent of having the conversations, because there are a lot of times that we think of an activity or we think to do something with the absolute best intentions, and we don't realize we missed an important aspect or we missed a group of people. And when we ask in a very comfortable way, people will bring that to our attention and we can say, ah, okay, so next time we do it, now I know that this is something that I need to change. So going quickly, being conscious of time, because it's clearly a topic Crystal and I are very passionate to talk about. And we have, a few more slides. Um, Thinking about relationships. And so Crystal and I were chatting about this a little bit earlier around creating a space where people can share if they want to, but making sure that that's welcome. And so managers will be a really, really great example to do this. It is, I would say, nearly impossible and maybe a little weird for an organization to mandate that, right? Like, as part of our organizational culture, we're going to start every meeting with you sharing like one interesting fact about you or something weird that happened over the weekend. Like, no, like that doesn't happen.
That.
But in meetings, and then, and it's interesting too, because I think over time you feel things out, and when you have, sometimes people just need to connect, and people might be going through different things. And so if it's one-on-one with your team member, I would say, a lot of us, I think, can have the mentality of, I have this agenda, we need to get a lot done. I have, these 5 bullet points we need to get through a meeting, and you get on the phone or on a call with somebody on your team and they just had a really rough weekend or they just had a really rough day. My recommendation would be to create a space for them to share that, because you might be worried that you're not going to get through your agenda, but for their mental well-being, for their emotional well-being, that time that you spend connecting and listening to them will pay off 100-fold for them as a human, and also for you as a team, because if they're opening up, that means they need that space to share. They need for you to understand where they're coming from. In my experience and from what I've seen in research, this happens more in one-on-ones. If you have a safe group of people, sometimes people will share that. I know at the beginning of pandemic, my son was a year and a half, and he was just the most energetic little boy. And I was working from home, and he was running around, and he was in all my meetings, and I was trying to, lead life as usual, and it was a mess. And I remember, because I work with a lot of mothers with young kids, I opened up about that because I figured more than likely a lot of them are going through something similar. So to hear me as a leader mention that made it easier for them to say, oh, you know what, I'm going nuts too, and like it's so hard. And so I saw that dynamic and that connection really go to the next level because of what I proactively shared as a leader. Um, and another thing about relationships, and again, this is in light of the hybrid working force, and light that we might not be able to turn around and, grab somebody for coffee real time, is to continue to talk about the importance of internal networks. How do you meet people in different departments? How do you create, and to Crystal's point even earlier too, just around creating events for people to connect, is a lot of times in your life, you're going to get a next great opportunity because of who you know,
Yep.
because you caught somebody's eye and you did something really amazing, and they're going to have a job opening and they'll think of you first before they maybe even post it on the internet, post it somewhere else. They'll think, ah, Crystal, she was really good at that. Let me call her and see if she's interested. From a development standpoint, too, you get to learn so much more about the organization, how it works. And so, this is something that I think can be organization influenced, but people are going to want to need to create those connections. Not everybody understands the value because maybe it's earlier in their career, maybe they've just not needed to do that before. But more and more, that visibility, the connection will be really critical. So, that's something else around the best practices around educating about people's networks. There's a ton, if you're in the area of people analytics, there's a ton around organizational network analysis today and who's connecting with who. And you can have a lot of different really cool data to understand who's connecting in the organization. You don't have to go all the way to that level, but to understand the importance, have that part of as an part of your organizational talk, I think is really, really critical for people, especially as we continue to iterate through these ways of different working.
And I think I would say, even as like a more seasoned manager or even HR, reach out to your younger managers, because just because we're used to being online doesn't mean we're good at it. And like, you know, I mean, I can like chat with the guys about X, Y, and Z, but trying to find those nuances isn't something that you're necessarily like trained on. Or maybe I should have been and I haven't. Like, and so, you know, but like reach out to your younger managers, because we're trying our best to like walk that blurred line. And yet,
Yeah.
did someone ever teach us that? Because, you know, I can talk about some of my older, you know, I have more like takeaways from older managers that's like, don't do that. So, but never like, oh, well, instead do this. It's more like you just learn what not to do instead of what to do.
Yeah. Oh,
And
absolutely. And I think that is such an incredibly important point, and I do want to highlight it also with one of the bullet points and the ways to gather feedback is actually again in our QuestionPro survey, and I default to it a lot because it's our data.
literally
And
just,
my leader told me I can talk about it openly, so it's not confidential. Is when I did the analysis, I actually found one item. I have found ways to stay connected to my colleagues while working remotely. There was a 20 percentage point difference between how men and women answer that, with women being lower. Now, if you were to take a step back and maybe stereotypically think about relationships, you might say, oh, but women are better, right? Like women are more caring. Like Crystal was saying, oh, her and I hit it off and like we became friends, you know, hundreds of thousands of miles away. But maybe that's unusual. Maybe both of us are outgoing. And actually, that is unusual based on the data that we saw. So think about Crystal as a leader. Think about me as a leader. If we never ran that survey, would have never thought that there was a problem because we don't have that problem.
yeah.
So if we don't, probably other women in our organization don't. So that's where, again, collecting that information. And I think that what's tough is I've seen a lot of leaders with the absolute best intentions in the world create programs, create changes based on what's impacted them. And a lot of times they're not nearly as effective as they expected. And they turn around like, well, what happened? Like I've worked so hard on this, I don't understand. It's because their needs were different than the general population and their workforce. And regardless of the effort, the best intentions, there was a big miss in that area. So that's again where we saw in our own data this really big difference between the different populations in our organization. So inclusion. I mean, that this could be so many hours of conversations because the world got messier. It's going to get messier. There's so many different factors happening. And so we need to be even more intentional, even more purposeful around inclusion. And we need to empower people to do it even more and even more effectively. So this is a similar item that we talked about before in collaboration. I mentioned that it very much impacts inclusion for organizations, for managers, for people to proactively pull individuals from different areas, from different backgrounds, from different cities, from different ages, to make sure that no matter where we are physically, we're creating a space where those ideas are shared. We're creating all of the different ecosystems, all of the different projects that have those different kinds of viewpoints, because it will help us tremendously as an organization. Um, Understanding how employee experience might be different. We've been talking about that so much, but it deserved its own bullet point. So here it is for the takeaway for anybody that downloads the slides or looks at them later. I just cannot stress that enough. There have been, I think to me, again, even as a researcher and somebody that's looked at this data, just the diversity in answers that we've seen over the last years has almost been unlike anything I've ever seen in research. And so having those questions, having those conversations, and looking at the information differently, and understanding the different populations, it just has to be a part of what we do. Because again, as we're creating a successful workforce, there are going to be a lot of different needs, and there are going to be a lot of different evolving needs. And even my friends that I talk with are saying, you know, my life changed so much in how I work that it really makes me think about what do I want in the future. They're not saying they know what it is, but they're saying they're wondering. And so they are going to be discovering. And some of these are some of the most successful people I know. As an employer, you want to be a part of that conversation because, especially as your best people are taking a step back and saying, do I go back to the way things are? What if my organization does that? But now this flexibility has opened my eyes to be able to do things differently. People are in self discovery mode. People are still trying to figure out, what is it that I really want? And you talk to some people who are like, get me back to the office. Like, I can't, like, I've heard the saying
I
recently
know
that
some
rings so
people who
true
are
is like,
so excited about it. And I'm like, oh no, I'm good, yo.
no. And I mean, there are people, and because there are people saying, like, I no longer work from home. I feel like I live at work
Yeah.
because of what my daily dynamic is. But I bet that a lot of those people that are so eager to go back are going to go back to commuting, are going to go back to, not having maybe some hours to do exercise or read they had before. And so, again, we're discovering ourselves.
Yeah.
We're going to need to do that together as the organization because we don't have the answers yet. And I listened to somebody recently and they were talking about bias training.
No.
And they said, one training will not solve it. There's no way all of us, every single human, even with the best intentions, we have certain innate biases. You can't give somebody one training and say, okay, done. We had the bias training, check. The same thing is about inclusion. We're going to need to talk about it. It's a space that we're going to need to measure, but man, it is going to be an ongoing process for a long time. So keep an eye on it. Don't ever stop talking about it. Don't stop thinking about different ways to, make people feel like they belong, make people feel like they're included in the organization as we continue to go through the changes. And the last and maybe my favorite item, I don't know, it's tied with inclusion. I really loved all of these because, again, Crystal and I were the ones who created the presentation as well-being. And wow, uh, has the last year been eye-opening about that, just how heavy of an impact work can have on people, how much it can have on our stress, on our mental well-being, on our burnout, physically, mentally, spiritually, all of that. It has just changed us in such significant ways. And the more that we experience this work and non-work blend,
Oh yeah,
the
we have a
more we
question
see
about it.
things. We do. Okay, I haven't been able to look at the questions, so
I know.
you'll have to tell me what
I
it
was like,
is.
some of them were like teeing up, and I was like, ooh, this is gonna be perfect.
um, well, this is something that I mean we can talk about forever, and we are still looking for answers to it. The big thing about it is I think it has to be included as part of the workplace. It doesn't delineate anymore because so much of what happens at work, so much around our stress to perform at our best, so much around worries. Are we going to lose our job? Are we doing the best that we can? Are we visible enough? There's so much going on in work that impacts everything about our lives that I think for organizations, again, it's not only the right thing to do by a person, but it's the right thing to do for their productivity, for their outputs, etc. So making sure to discuss it, to be open about it, understanding your people, providing support is absolutely critical. And here, that was by far the longest section in our survey. And, rightfully so, because it was actually an area where we had the greatest opportunity to improve, not surprisingly, because everybody is being so taxed. So I'm sorry, I gave you a long list. You don't have to use all of it. Again, you don't have to use any of it. But I felt I was trying to cut some items and I think I cut a few, but I hope that these were some of my favorites as far as how do you really understand people and how do we evolve that understanding. With that, Crystal, what was the question? And there you got.
Have you have any experience working with bosses who expect you to work 24/7 around the clock? And how do you manage that or avoid it and ensure a work-life balance? As we have a life too. Dot, dot, dot.
um, well, so I would say, based on the research that I've done, that many people have experienced that. We so it was interesting. One of the things from a person standpoint, it's about managing expectations. It's
Mhm.
about going back to goals. So I don't know what the person's particular job is, but it's also clearing up and saying, listen, I know the times are really tough. I know there's a lot of expected from you as a leader. There's a lot of expected from the organization. This job is really meaningful to me. I want to provide all the value I can. But what I'm finding myself do is that, my work hours are basically all of my hours in the day. And
Yeah.
it's really hard for me to, continue my life that way. I need that balance. I need to spend time with family, friends, and my well-being. And if you don't have goals clearly articulated, that's a great time to say, hey, let's talk about expectations. Let's
Mhm.
make them as black and white as possible. And then let's measure against those. Because what I believe I can do and what I want to do is accomplish these same things, but I need to do it in fewer hours.
Yep.
And if I can't, maybe it's a question of capacity. Maybe it's a question of, one person is being asked to do more than they're capable of. And then you need to look for a different solution. You either need to look for help, or as an individual, you won't be there forever. And if a manager is a good manager, they'll know that. They'll know that you'll have an alternative. And so it is in their best interest to help. I think sometimes we're vocal about it, and maybe the person on the other end still doesn't get it fully or doesn't get how much it impacts us. Other times maybe we're not as vocal as we should be, so all of a sudden, it goes unnoticed, but it's this huge sense of frustration. So to boil it down, I think again, being clear that that's happening, setting specific goals. And then at the end of the day, if it's not a situation that you can change, I would either look for a different role in the organization, or maybe it's just not the right organizational fit. Because as much as I would love to say that having an honest conversation can change every manager and every person, it's not possible. So I think it's worth the effort, because if the person's asking that question, obviously they still care for the organization that they're in. So those would be just a few of my tips on the individual
I
level.
think it also goes back to your self-discovery that employees are doing right now. And
Hmm.
self-discovery is not always comfortable. But if you're evaluating your workplace from an employee perspective, that could be an exercise, and that's going to be tough. And
Yeah.
sometimes leaving a company is like breaking up with a bad boyfriend, like,
Yeah.
frankly.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, like, as as HR, or culture managers, like, make sure that you also are noticing employees when they're employee evaluating. Like, that's
Yeah.
important to be like, oh, I know my employees are going to go through self discovery because they may have had a kid in quarantine, they may have moved, they had, there's a
Right.
lot of things that are going to impact how they view the company just as much as the company views them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually brings us to our next point, because I feel like these days I can't talk without talking about empathy. Um, it's so important, but it's also so, like we talked about the personal standpoint. I think it's also so much on the manager of understanding somebody else, because we talked about capacity now. What also happened, it could have happened, is somebody might have been with a company for years and they were able to get things done. And guess what? This crazy pandemic changed us. It's hard for many people. We
Mhm.
want to show up to work. And you know what? Sometimes we're just dealing with more in our lives than we were before, or we're tired, or we're anxious, or whatever it is. We cannot deliver at the same rate as we could before. And it's okay. We're humans. It happened during this pandemic. So, from the leader standpoint, to be in tuned, and again, to make sure your people feel appreciated, stay in touch with them, understand their capacity, understand how they're doing, is so incredibly important. How you ask people, and doing it in a way where you're creating an open space, whether it's in a one on one conversation or whether it's in a survey, making sure you're telling them, listen, I care about you. And it's
Mhm.
been an incredibly difficult year. How are you doing? What do you need? What can we do differently? Doing it really sincerely is really important. And then taking action on that information, of course, is invaluable. And how you act on it and how you make sure that people feel heard is really important. I included a video from Brene Brown on empathy. It's one of my favorite videos. And she talks about, because I think sometimes we think, empathy. So how do I do it? What is it? What's the difference between compassion? Do I look for silver linings? It's a quick video, but it's really valuable in a way to connect with people, in a way to understand, how do I create a space where a person can feel safe opening up and sharing information with me.
And we'll
So
send
we'll
that out.
leave
We'll send
people.
the link out to everyone too.
Yes. And so we just have two more slides. I'm conscious of time, so I'll go through them relatively quickly. So evolving the working model, again, we probably touched on this point numerous times, but acknowledging your own biases, why it's so incredibly to ask people how they're doing, why it's so incredibly to collect information, because we're not all experiencing the same thing. We don't all have the same needs. Challenging assumptions all the time. So again, this is how we've done it. This is how it's worked. This is how we've done it in the pandemic. It doesn't matter. Is there a better way to do it? Let's think about a better way to do it. And this idea actually came across recently. I just absolutely loved it in journey mapping. So how do you create a path for what the employee is going through? What is their journey? What's getting easier with certain things? What's getting harder? So, great, you're working from home, so you don't have the commute. That's easier. Maybe you can have a little more flexibility in your hours because now you have the 30 minutes at the beginning or then. What gets harder? My 2.5-year-old coming in and saying, Mama, 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 outside of my door, sometimes during important meetings. Do we create a culture where that's okay? Um, Things happening like my internet running out. I have this like huge, like, I don't even know how many feet Ethernet cord they gave out on me at the beginning of the presentation. And Crystal so graciously, started us all out until I returned. And so they're just life events that are going to happen. And so, how do we anticipate certain things? How do we ask about them and correct for them? Another really big one, I think, is empowering leaders to make changes. So, a lot of times, especially in larger organizations, I've talked to people that said, it takes us about half a year to think about a survey and ask our employees what they're feeling, and then a few more months to come up with the data because we're in so many different places and so many countries. And so, there needs to be so much approval. I think those are great, but I don't think they're a substitute for empowering leaders to do things what's right for their team. And so that's going to be for some organizations really challenging the norms, but I think it's the right thing to do and the right thing to think about to have the greatest amount of impact. And then also committing to the number of times you're going to do these kinds of check-ins throughout the year because months can go by quickly. And you can take a step back and again realize where are my best people going, what's going on, and realize you didn't ask anyone for 6 months how they are, and the entire world around us changed. So our wrap up slide with hot 4 minutes to go is, we started out with a statistic around culture. And that one of the reasons why leaders and executives were worried about having people in different places was because how do you maintain culture? Well, as Crystal was saying, her sitting in Austin, me sitting in Buenos Aires, our colleagues sitting anywhere from New York to LA to Munich to Pune, like, I mean, I could go on listing the cities, is that it's really the values that tie us together. We're still very much an organization, we're still very much connected. Now is the time to take a step back and look at your organizational values and say, what are those? Do we need to change any? Do we need to create some if we don't have them? Do we need to change any because of the way the world has changed around us? And these are just some of the key ones to consider if they're not a part of your values, something that I've seen come up a lot. I'm not saying go out and add those if you don't have them, but to consider trust, agility, accountability, etc. So values, shared, clear, strong, and prominent will tire people no matter where they are in the world. And the same thing with purpose. It's not just about what is the organizational purpose, but also how each individual ties into that, how each individual makes an impact. And it's a really great exercise to do as an organization. It's a really great reminder for managers, for leaders to talk to their specific people, to talk to their specific teams, because when you're fighting something for something all together and you believe in it, your commitment again is going to be so much stronger no matter where you are. Time and place. So again, theme throughout is that it should be about what you're delivering, not when you're doing it, not where you're doing it, sometimes not even
Because I don't
how, because the
stand
best things happen.
You mean I don't stand at my desk for 8 hours? I've obviously delivered quality content.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like,
Like Tim
it
Ferriss
doesn't like
wrote the
there,
4-hour work week for a reason.
yes. So these are some things that we just, the norms that we need to continue to challenge, because I think we're going to come up with a world of work that's hopefully we'll look back pre-pandemic at some point and be like, wow, I can't even believe this is how we used to run our businesses. So motivate yourself to think in creative ways, think about different ideas, and then the idea of sense of equity and justice. So having meaningful conversations often, it's really been a theme throughout our time together, but it's going to be hard. People are going to be choosing their path. They're going to be doubting if they chose the right thing. Their organizations are going to be doing the same thing. We're all in this together. We've got to learn, we've got to iterate, but we have to try and we have to be bold. But make sure that you're talking to your people, communicating what you're doing, and even more importantly, getting their input, because in that sense, it really brings everything back full circle. And it will help us, again, get to a much better place where both people and organizations can win. I wholeheartedly believe in a much better and more profound way than we ever could before. So hopefully that that gives you a little bit of optimism, a little bit of, hope for the future, and hopefully also the desire to really test, challenge the norms, and be bold in creating a future that was many ways different and much better than the past. So I don't know, Crystal, I know we're at time. This is our contact information if you want to reach out to us a little bit more on our website for people that can hang out a few extra minutes. I don't know if there were any
We got a few
burning questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, a few good ones that I know at least one I can answer because of years of event experience. So someone said, virtual collaboration / engagement is quite challenging. Any best practices you can share for organizing online events or engagements or programs? And I have given this so much thought. I've seen some of my friends' companies do it spectacularly well. I have not cracked it yet for necessarily, but one of I have a friend, they hosted a whiskey tasting and they got whiskey delivered to everyone's homes, and then they hired this, like, not a sommelier because that's wine, but the equivalent for whiskey. He took them through an entire whiskey tasting. The sales guys didn't do one sales pitch. It just was like a hang session. They invited some customers that were good friends, and it was more of just like a let's hang out and like sing songs.
Yeah.
There was like a guy with a banjo. It was like so crazy. But in traditional event planning, I was always taught that you have to have 11 touches to ensure someone will show up to your event. And that's the thing, is you can't assume that your employees want to come. Because especially if it's at a 5 p.m. on a Friday or something like that, you know what they don't want to be doing at 5 p.m. on a Friday is logging on to Zoom. Because frankly, they could have popped out at 3 o'clock and taken the afternoon off and been much happier. And so don't assume that your employees want to come. Don't always center it around alcohol is another big key.
Yeah.
That's definitely something I think we use as a crutch a lot, is using alcohol events as let's do a happy hour. Let's do this. Let's do that. And it's like, well, that's not exactly cool for everyone. And there's a very large movement for, zero proof cocktails that's happening. But again, like, do a morning coffee hang or invite, a band to host morning coffee, like a jam session, but ensure that your employees, it fits within kind of the hourly structure that they want to work.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you make it work, they're not going to want to come. And like, don't forget, just remind them, like, half the time your employee, like, I feel like I can tell the team, like, I can share as many marketing Mondays as I can. And then they're like, hey, so like, are we doing a webinar this week? And you're like, yes, doing a webinar this week. So always remember, like, you have to market your employees just like you market to your customers, because you're asking them to create time. And time is the most valuable thing they have. So yeah, it's a challenge. Every company cracks it differently, but I've seen some do it really well.
Great suggestions. I love it. I actually learned something too.
There's another one on here that I thought was really good, is, do you think personal finances are affected in the new world? I spend so much more on groceries than I used to because I'm home all the time, and my electricity bill went up. I didn't even think about it. So
well, and it's interesting because and so it's really, I love your example, because in my mind I thought of, like, well, the electricity for sure, but almost the opposite when it comes to food. So I usually brought my lunch to work, but I would say it was more the exception than the norm. Most people, I would say, ran out and bought lunch, right? And they would go and get like a salad or a burger or sushi or whatever. That adds up a lot more than groceries too, if you think about it, if you're doing takeout for lunch 5 times a week. So funny, I think, that example of the differences, and you're like, oh no, like, it's skyrocketed. I'm like, but for this reason, I'm like, oh no, but I would assume because you're buying groceries, you're spending less money. So maybe I don't need to give you a stipend as an HR team or as a people team, because But now it's about asking, right? Because people's realities are so different.
Mhm.
We did a whole live show around the personal finances, and I do think that it changed, and it changed, God, like in so many different ways. Whether you're how much money you're spending on the commute, if you're spending money on the commute, because some people can walk to work. Your internet, is the company paying for that? Your groceries, your electricity bill, your air
I almost
conditioning
bought
bill,
a
the
house.
or like, yeah. I mean, there's so many differences, but like on the flip end, so there could be so many things being dinged, or oh, I'm saving money because I remember when I lived in London, I was paying, like, even for a train, I was paying like what I think it translates to like $70 a day just for a train,
Yeah.
right? To go back and forth. If I worked really late and I had to get a taxi or an Uber, like I don't know, I remember how much that was. So does it have an impact? I think absolutely. Are people experiencing all the same ways? No, even
No.
based on our quick chat. Is it going to be important for organizations to know more about that? Yes, because that's also like when you're thinking about benefits and what you're offering to people, you actually might need to diversify because you could have people with different needs. And so you don't want to unintentionally penalize somebody because you're not offering all of a sudden a benefit that could be really useful to a much larger part of your population than it ever was before. So that I think is also a really, really valuable place where you can ask people for open-ended input, whether it's in one-on-ones or for us. I remember when we did our last survey, I don't know if you remember, Chris, we did something like 5 open-ended questions. And I remember one of my colleagues saying, like, are you crazy? Who's going to write in there? And I said, okay, well, we'll make them not mandatory, but I want to open up a dialogue for people to share what they think. And it's incredible. I would say probably 80% of the survey respondents actually wrote something in for every single question because they had a lot to tell us. So those are kind of those like exploratory things where I think people could, one, share with us really different needs that maybe we don't anticipate because their lives are currently different than ours, and two, actually share some really creative ideas. Because I know when I talk to Crystal, when I talk to Evan, a lot of my colleagues in the US, they tell me like, oh, I've thought about this or just this. I'm like, really? Like, it wasn't even on my radar. I didn't know that existed. So both from identifying problems or potential future challenges, and as well as finding solutions, I think crowdsourcing ideas like that could be really invaluable.
Mhm. Here we go. We got a new one popped in. Working virtually is all about integrity and trust. Hard to guarantee, though. How do you manage this with your employees? I was like, I have
Easy
something really
question.
sassy to
No,
say, but it's not webinar appropriate.
no, I, I think it's really tough, and I think that's why you'll continue to hear me say it a million times. Is it's about the deliverables. It's about being very intentional and specific what you expect out of people, and if they can deliver on it, it's good. And I think in that way, unless you should trust the quality of their work at a basic level. And if they don't, I think it's a good starting point for a conversation to understand what are the hurdles. Now, it could, if somebody's saying, oh, I'm trying all these different things and it's not just working, and you're thinking, oh, but I've been in that job and that seems unlikely, that's when you maybe need to open up the window and say, hey, let's work a little more closely together. Include me in your activities. I really want to help, if that trust doesn't exist. Now, what you could also find is that maybe that person doesn't know how to do something that you do, and so it's a great teaching opportunity. Or if you're working with them more closely and there are those trust issues, they're much more likely to come up. But and just because we're sitting next to someone, unless we're like staring at their computer or looking at their phone or whatever job they're doing, the trust could still be there. It obviously gets magnified remotely, but I think it has to be the peeling back the onion. Like, what is our end goal? Why are we not getting there? What kind of conversation are we having? But it's hard. Like,
I think
trust is
I,
definitely not easy.
I think I'd probably have a lot more self accountability sitting at home. And this is probably just a little bit of other conversations, but it's like I'm more worried about deliverables when I'm at home because there is you doubt that your manager doubt or that your manager doubts, but at the same time sitting in an office for 7 hour or 8 hours but really get 4 hours of work after lunch breaks and this and that, like that, if you really take an honest look at office life versus home life, even like I'm gonna go to the chiropractor at 3 and not feel bad about it, frankly, because it's like we're up working at 7, and you can get just as much work done. And you have to look at it's not just about like what your employees are doing, but overall just general kind of like self awareness of what
Yeah.
office life used to look like, and now being like, oh well, they probably did get all their work done in 4 hours, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard though. I put a lot of stress on myself. That's a side note. But there's a few more that are just, in here, but we can always send answers out in the email. Make sure
Yeah.
you forward it to your colleagues. We are so glad that you guys joined us. And thank you, Sanja, so much for your insights and your wisdom.
No, I mean, thank you, Crystal. Thank you, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be a part of these conversations. Thank you all for the questions. If you have any follow-ups, like Crystal said, we'll send additional answers, but please feel free to reach out to us because this is a conversation, even though I know that you see my face and you see Crystal's face and you have, a question box, so maybe it doesn't seem as fluid, but we're really, really huge believers that we need to be in this, all of us together. And so anything that's on your mind, we have actually Tuesday shows. I do it with our friend Maddie Grant, where we tackle a lot of these questions. It's quick 20 minutes. We've talked about mental well-being. We've talked about burnout. We've talked about financial stress. We've so many different topics. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the imposter syndrome. And
Woo!
so if there's some topics that you'd like to talk about, whether it's with us personally, just hear from us about, please do reach out because the more we keep this conversation going between all of us, I think the better off we're going to be. So thank you, Crystal, for organizing the webinar. Thank you all so much for coming. And for all of you who are still here, like hanging out with us way past time, you're the best. We'll be doing more of these webinars on some of the contemporary topics. But in the meantime, yes, please stay in touch. And thank you so much again for your time and for joining us today.
Thanks, guys.